first two members of our cast are Anon, a very chatty girl, and Tomori, a very shy girl. The first time they have a decent conversation is over a plaster, or a band-aid, for you US folks out there. Anon trips over, Tomori gets out a big collection of cute bandages, and having a rare opportunity to share her collection with someone else, Tomori gets very excited. The two have a slight falling out at the end of the first episode, mostly as a result of Tomori's low self-esteem, but the next day, when Anon sees Tomori organising her bandage collection, which is probably how she deals with anxiety, Anon strikes up a conversation. Tomori's so happy to have someone to talk to that she offers another bandage, and even though Anon doesn't really need it, she accepts. Nothing about their feelings is said in the scene directly, but you start to get the sense that this is what their friendship looks like. Skipping forward through the episode a bit, Anon makes a new friend named Soyo, a girl who used to be friends with Tomori, and at the end of the day, Anon lazily lounges around the house while staring at the DM she'd sent to her newly added contact, and eventually her thoughts drift over to her friendship with Tomori, and the camera cuts over to, you guessed it, the bandages. After these key moments, the visual language has been established and it can quickly fall into the background as a way of telling you things without actually having to tell you things. For example, when the two aren't on good terms, for whatever reason, Anon's hands might have these generic brown wrappings, but on days when the two are friendly with one another, those generic bandages will be replaced with some signature Tomori style ones, patterned with, the cute animals, and of course, as all good visual metaphors do, the bandages come back to hit you hard emotionally a couple times. Once, as a way for the two to bandage, literally, a damaged friendship with another bandmate, and once, at the very end of the show, to bookmark the entire metaphor. MyGO's general character writing style is well represented in the two initial band members that we get in episode 2, Chihaya Anon and Nagasaki Soyo. A big focus can be put on comparing and contrasting these characters in order to explain things without, once again, actually explaining things. In this example, the more you learn about Anon, the more you learn about Soyo. Let's see how they do it. This is Anon transferring late into a school. She's wearing these thick rimmed glasses, acting prim and proper in front of a teacher, bragging about being student council president at a previous school. This is step 1 of her plan to start over. What does that mean? Why is she starting over? What went wrong before? Immediately, we get the sense that she cares about her image, about how other people see her, and we can tell there's a deeper reason for it. It's not just vanity. Once she transfers into school, the glasses go away. The image she was selling to her teacher is different to the image she's now selling to her classmates. Her image, the performance she was putting on in her past, has now changed. And as she plops herself down in a seat, she looks over the class and wonders, friends don't come naturally to Anon. It's part of a plan. When her targets here ask what they should call her, more, what did they call you at your previous school? We learn that Anon wore glasses at her previous school and that everyone there called her Chihaya. They distantly refer to her by her family name while heaping on praise about how impressive she is. The image she had at her previous school is clear. She was a humble object of worship, and since she wants to change that, it must have gone pretty poorly. So, here at her new school, when asked what people called her at her previous school, she says she'd like to be called Anon. She says it in a way to imply that Anon is what people used to call her, but it's not a direct lie. And that's a trend you'll see a lot in Anon's dialogue. She doesn't technically lie, but she exaggerates and she has a bunch of excuses on hand to skirt around that truth. And if her self-obsession wasn't clear enough with her wanting to be the lead guitarist and vocalist of a band, the conversation with her classmates here ends with her wondering, This girl, who is not used to putting on a fake smile all day, dusts off her old guitar, fails to tune it, gives up, and calls it a day. But when we later learn that Anon bragged to her middle school classmates about studying abroad in order to seem impressive and intelligent to them, she didn't stop at bragging. She actually went to study abroad. And that may make you wonder how far she's willing to go to actually live up to the lies that she makes for herself. In essence, she's an insecure girl who cares about her image way too much. She tries to play her desired part as the lead character, the cute girl everyone likes, a great musician, but she's clearly not up to it. And she's quick to lose motivation. But for some reason, she keeps going, even if she's not up to it, because it's her honest desire. She seems like a deceptive person playing a part, but she's really just honest about what she wants. She's trying to become someone that she isn't, and she isn't satisfied with playing pretend. Now, Nagasaki Soyo is introduced as a mediator. She puts on this sickly sweet voice, she plays very politely around everyone, and she tries to make sure everyone gets along and is happy. But the words that she says are... well, let's look at some words that she directs at a friend who is trying to leave a band that she's a part of. No one said that. Assigning responsibility to someone that doesn't want that responsibility. The second scene we see of her after this, she's trying to get back in contact with that same old friend via a mutual friend. The person she's asking for info from shakes her head. She then dramatically steps off to one side, looks afar, expresses worry about the person she's trying to find, and turns back to the person she's trying to get info from. Upon getting no response, she sighs and keeps up the prodding by expressing regret over her own actions. Can you see the manipulation this girl's pulling off in order to get what she wants? Think of the thoughts that must be running through her mind before she says each line of dialogue. How can I get this person to give over the info I want? Ask them directly. Imply I think they're lying. Pretend I'm just worried about the person I'm trying to see. I'll pull out the sub-story. Pretend that I've changed. Pretend that I regret my actions. Whatever gets your foot in the door. So she acts friendly, but in doing so, she projects a lot of her assumptions onto others, and she assigns a bunch of responsibilities to other people in order to pressure them into upholding those responsibilities. And it's with these two characters, Anon and Soyo, meeting in episode 2, that makes the difference between them night and day. When Soyo hears a familiar name from Anon's mouth, she takes note of Anon's school uniform, so she goes to that school. When Anon asks a question, Soyo doesn't even listen to it. Anon isn't a factor in this conversation. She's just a resource of information. You know, when Anon rested her head in her hands while plotting up that let's make friends plan in school earlier, Soyo here raises her chin, rests it atop her linked fingers, looking down on whoever's opposite the table. That's the difference. While Anon focuses on starting over from scratch, Soyo is clinging to the past, unwilling to let go. They are pretenders. But where Anon here funnels those efforts into becoming the person she wants to become, Soyo wants to make others live the life she wants for them. To put it simply, Anon fakes it until she makes it. Soyo gaslights you into thinking that fake is real. We see how truly fake Soyo is by comparing her to Anon. In this same scene in episode 2, we learn that Soyo transferred in to a school for rich ladies, and she learned to appear posh by mimicking those around her. We can instantly compare this strip of information with what we know of Anon. Anon's performance began as a way to seem impressive, but Soyo's began as a way to fit in with impressive people. It was a survival tactic. And now that we've seen how Soyo has weaponized her fake nature in order to get what she wants from other people, Anon's goals seem almost aimless in comparison. In 2 episodes, these 2 characters already have so many ways to relate to one another and to see eye to eye, but so many ways to clash and conflict over the differences in their upbringings, and that's just the dynamic between these 2 characters. Once you start lumping in other band members, such as the shy girl Tomori, who doesn't fit in at school and maintains her honest personality, I mean, just saying that is enough for you to start joining the dots, right? Tomori doesn't fit in at school, like Soyo didn't, like Anon didn't, but she's still honest, unlike Soyo or Anon. The comparisons are natural, and how would that affect you? Being exposed to people so relatable to you, but so different from you. Looking at someone and thinking, we started in similar places, but this is how they ended up, and this is how I ended up. Would you feel envious of them? Superior to them? Ashamed by the way you identify with their worst habits, or motivated by the ways they've improved that you haven't? And that's MyGO's cast. It's a band of people relating to one another. So episode 3 is all about Tomori, our quiet, fragile, lonely little vocalist. But how do you get inside the mind of a girl who's too afraid to speak? Well, you get inside her mind. This is Tomori's perspective. The entire episode is Tomori's perspective. It's an episode told in first person, exploring the mindset and trauma of the girl who brings our main cast together. And, as all themed episodes should, it begins with a thesis.
昔からちょっとずれて生きていたんだと思う。
Tomori is graduating from middle school, and before she has time to even think about what that means, her classmates have begun crying and saying farewell to one another, and in this moment, Tomori feels out of pace with the rest of the world. So, to find more about her quirks and to see if this feeling is true, the viewer is sent hurtling back in time to when Tomori was just a little toddler. She was that kind of child, you know the one, the girl who loved rocks and bugs and stuff. Even if she was able to make friends with someone else who was fascinated by rocks, there was no guarantee that that friend wouldn't be frightened of bugs. A lesson Tomori learned at a very young age. Her interests weren't compatible with the world she lived in. She was able to make friends by reining in her quirkiness a bit, playing a part, if you will, but even then, she was never quite on the same page as anyone else. Her perspective was so different from normal that she always felt isolated. One such case, a misunderstanding, happens when a girl named Sakiko scrapes her knee while stopping Tomori from jumping off a bridge. She was just grabbing a petal, she wasn't jumping at all, it was her being out of sync with the world again. But the two quickly become friends over it because Tomori offers to... Bandages, friendship, we get the point now. And yes, Tomori doesn't fit in at school and plays a part like Soyo and Anon, everything, it comes back around, it's all linked, there's gonna be overlap between all of these little comments that I make about the show. Anyway, as you may be able to tell already, the episode that we are looking at here is a structural marvel. Not only does it have this cool first-person perspective gimmick going on to give it a unique visual identity that complements the themes of the episode, and not only does it propose a point at the beginning and go on to substantiate that point, but also everything we've learned from the past 2 episodes comes into play here from an entirely new and very personal perspective. The bandages suddenly means so much more. But the meat of the episode begins when Tomori and Sakiko become friends. As we're seeing the world from Tomori's mind, we suddenly understand exactly where the lyrics that she's writing come from. We understand her entirely. But Sakiko, an outside observer who will never get this kind of insight into the lyrics, still empathizes with them. You know, she sees herself in what Tomori writes, even though she isn't in the same space that we are. She understands on a personal, person-to-person level by projecting herself and her worries onto what Tomori writes. Remember what I asked in the previous section? If you were faced with such a difference in similarity, how would it affect you? Even when Tomori was in her old band, formed by someone who resonated with her lyrics and had similar interests, it all fell apart in the blink of an eye for a reason no one understands. Even when things seem perfect, Tomori is still out of sync with the world. No one she meets will see the perspective we're being shown throughout this episode. As a result of them presenting the episode this way, you start to realise how hard Tomori's situation must be. No one will understand her like we do right now, and that's the problem Tomori faces. It's an insecurity that can never truly heal. All she can do is cover it with a bandage and pretend it will get better, knowing deep down that it won't. At the start of episode 4, Anon enters her classroom and greets Tomori, as usual. It takes a few seconds for the greeting to actually reach Tomori, but eventually she responds in kind. Even when it comes to something as simple as a greeting, Tomori is still out of sync with the world. They even throw in a sneaky first-person shot here to remind you of the previous episode's events. Very well done. When Anon and Soyo met in episode 2, there was another character present in that scene. When Tomori was part of that old band, there was another character present in that scene. The character I've neglected to mention so far is this girl, Shina Taki. Taki is a great drummer, a typical harsh tsundere, and she's also Tomori's biggest fan. She makes her entrance at the end of episode 1 by just passionately defending Tomori from Anon's friendly advances, and that's a really fitting portrayal of their relationship. Taki loves Tomori. She thinks that Tomori is an amazing singer and writer. She loved being in the same band together, and she is so proud and she's so protective. But as we now know, Tomori isn't always on the same page as everyone else, and she's pretty self-demeaning, so normal praise doesn't reach her like praise should. Combine this with Taki's own awkwardness. Taki struggles to be honest with her feelings, she relates with Tomori's lyrics, and you get this couple of characters that enjoy being together, but they can't quite bridge this strange emotional rift between them. When Taki says something like, "Of course Tomori's lyrics are great," we know she's saying that because she loves Tomori's lyrics. She loves Tomori. But to someone like Tomori, she probably hears that and assumes that it's a matter of expectation. Of course her lyrics are good, she's the songwriter. If they weren't good, we'd have kicked her. It's her job to be good at writing lyrics. And that's the gap that's implied between them. It's never spoken out loud, the characters never sit down and explain this difference in mindset, but it's presented pretty clearly in the way they interact with each other. Taki's compliments aren't direct enough to block out any of the negative fantasies that Tomori's nervous wreck of a brain may conjure, and because she can't be honest, they can never end up on the same page. They can never understand each other truly. And that's the preamble for this episode's coverage, because in this episode, as the band begin to form, these two girls get a little moment to reunite for the first time since their old band broke apart, which I don't actually know how long ago that was, but when the day's done, the members all decide to head home. Taki and Tomori split off from Anon and Soyo. It's not actually explained in this episode, but later on we learn that Taki has decided to walk Tomori home. That's a routine they had in their previous band. So this bittersweet piano plays in the background, the two quietly walk side by side through these late night streets, and here, in this shot, they begin out of frame on the left. Their barely visible heads plod along to the right as they walk, and then we cut to a shot of traffic driving down the street. The headlights of the cars illuminate this pavement and they make the shadows dance. The motions of the shadows rotate around the fence and it matches the motion of Tomori and Taki moving in the previous shot. So the momentum carries through this moment seamlessly. Your eyes glide from the left side of the frame to the right seamlessly with the previous frame, and to continue that momentum from left to right, the duo begin walking into frame very rapidly, moving once again from left to right, the first two footsteps land them smack dab in the middle of the frame, where your eyes are ready and waiting for action to happen. The action is still incomplete, this walking motion continues along the pavement, and that is how the shot resolves. But it's the motion, the gentle motion, and this bittersweet piano that just lulls you into the moment. The scene comes to a close with Taki happy to be reunited with Tomori, but since she's not the type to easily express that kind of happiness straightforwardly, she instead laments that if she'd graduated properly, they'd have been able to go to the same school. Whether or not Tomori picks up on Taki's affection is honestly hard to tell. She leaves Taki right then and there with a hopeful "see you later." The two don't really get an opportunity to talk properly in this moment, but for now, they're together again. The wistfully bittersweet nature of reuniting with someone you haven't seen in a while, that feeling lingers as the shot fades to a close. It's a quiet moment between two quiet people, and it's the perfect way to establish this relationship really early on into the show. There's one shot in episode 5 that I immediately fell in love with. It's a scene between Taki and Soyo. The two do not see eye to eye, to put it simply. Taki is focused on her desire to play in a band with Tomori, but Tomori's afraid the band will split up if they perform on stage, because their previous band split up the day after performing on stage. Essentially, I mean, there was some time in between, but the writing was on the wall. Meanwhile, Soyo wants her old band back. She has Taki and she has Tomori, but Anon isn't a member of that band. She's in the way. Soyo never intended Anon to commit to the band thing. Anon is just a pretender, right? She has no backbone, so if Soyo can convince Tomori to perform live, Anon will get cold feet and she will leave the band because she can't perform. It's the perfect plan. Or at least, that's what the visuals tell me. The shot looks like this. This is a moment of Taki's heartfelt desire, matched by Soyo's manipulations. The two rest at these different points of elevation in different degrees of light, this distance between them. Taki declares she recognizes herself in Tomori's lyrics, and she wants to be in a band, together, a real band. Soyo lurks in the shadows, but as soon as she realizes that Taki is the key to making Tomori perform, her scheme can begin. Knowing that Taki doesn't want to be apart from Tomori, Soyo twists the knife. I'm sure your feelings will reach her. She'll understand. And this inspires Taki to make her stand. And for Soyo, this is mission complete. But that's not the end of this scenery. This is actually a recurring shot, kinda. It comes up time and time again, and while I could give every single example and show how it relates to this moment, let's just leave it at one scene, for brevity. Unfortunately for Tomori, her fears come true. Soyo isn't on the same page as everyone else, but she's just the most obvious one. No one in this band is truly on the same page. The cycle repeats, the band fails to truly understand one another, and Tomori is left alone. But that wouldn't be a happy ending, would it? Tomori's sick of sadness. She goes out on her own to try and communicate with her now-gone friends one last time, in the only way she knows how, by singing. One by one, the members get brought back into the fold, and the scene that brings Taki resolution is a direct follow-up to the one we just covered. Again, two people, different levels, different light, two people on the wrong page, out of sync with one another. But they've realised that now. They have an awareness, and Taki accepts that although she thought she was acting in Tomori's best interests, realistically, she was just thinking about herself and what she wanted, and that's why Soyo's manipulations were able to work. But Taki can't bridge that gap in understanding between two people alone. She's not good at communicating. After all, we know this, so someone else bridges the gap. Tomori walks on over, redefining the visual language of this moment in the process, and now they still exist at different heights, but they see eye to eye. They're on the same level of understanding, and for the purpose of this section of analysis, this scenery's function has been resolved. It first existed to show that Taki and Soyo weren't understanding one another, but it was reused to show what the process of understanding looks like for this show's visual language. And for Soyo, this is mission failed. Before we get into episode 6, let's back it up a bit to focus on another crucial character that I haven't mentioned yet. Episode 5 began with this strange girl entering the band's practice room. She takes hold of this vintage guitar, opens up a case of metaphorical cash, takes a brief glance at some sheet music, plays a chord, sees if any notes are out of tune, identifies the single string that's out of tune, fixes it by ear, and then begins to play the song. In case you can't tell, this little oddball is an incredibly experienced guitarist. This is Kaname Rana, the final member of our new band, and as we learn in episode 6, she's the youngest member. She's a free spirit who does whatever she wants, and if you couldn't already tell, she's a genius. Equipped with her grandmother's guitar, she steps up to play, then takes off when she's satisfied, and that's how this girl lives. This free-loving nature causes a lot of conflict in this episode because Taki, not having the talent or experience to improvise solutions while writing a song for the group, doesn't know how to factor this girl into any composition she makes. Will this girl even show up to play in the band? Should she even write this girl into the songs that she makes? Also, Anon's confidence levels flounder when placed in a band with an actual pro-level guitarist as a partner because Anon doesn't really know how to play guitar. So Rana's less of a band member and more of this stray cat that hangs around whenever it wants to, causing carnage unwittingly. And the first thing we learn about her via dialogue is that she hangs around the live house sometimes, and also she likes eating matcha and soba. That's an important detail, remember that. So, this little girl goes around town with an expensive vintage guitar and a bunch of fancy equipment, playing whatever she pleases, around whoever she pleases, slurping up soba, and spending far too much on matcha-based desserts than any middle schooler should be able to. Furthermore, she speaks in this very matter-of-fact way. She doesn't really care how she appears to anyone else, and weirdest of all, her way of referring to Tomori is a blunt, spoken in a way that, like an old talent scout or a livehouse owner would speak when judging talent. She gets people's attention by tugging on their sleeve like a child. In her free time, she stays late at school playing with cats, or she hangs out outside an old abandoned livehouse that's not exactly a hangout spot for a middle schooler. Before we were formally introduced to her in episode 5, Rana is sometimes seen messing around in the background of other scenes. But it's back in episode 4, after Tomori vows to play in a band for the rest of her life, that Rana's interest in joining the band is piqued. Her motives are as plain as can be. She wants a band that she can play in for the rest of her life. That's all she cares about. And in a group of 4 other members who feel they don't have a place to exist, it only makes sense that Rana, our 5th and final member, feels the same way. So you can put it together in your head very easily. Why does someone so young, with such childish behaviour, have such confidence with a guitar? Well, clearly she's been playing from a young age, taught presumably by the grandmother who owned the fancy guitar that she uses. She has a large appetite, she's used to being spoiled, she eats soba and matcha as a habit, and she has some speaking habits that are very clearly picked up from someone large and in charge. Are you getting it yet? She's Grandma's favourite grandchild, and that Grandma must have been someone impressive. We do eventually, in like episode 11 or 12, get some dialogue that makes this point a little clearer, but for 10 episodes, her backstory is drip-fed to the point where you can piece it all together anyway. This is a girl who clearly came from a very loving home. She's pampered to hell and back, but now she's roaming around looking for somewhere comfortable to stay. a replacement to the loving home she once used to know. She's a stray cat. In case you're not getting it, she's a stray cat. That somewhere comfortable that I mentioned ends up being this lifelong band of girls who feel out of sync with the rest of the world. Remember, this is a show about people relating to the lyrics that this lonely songwriter jots onto a piece of paper. When watching how Rana behaves, relate her to what you know of the other band members. Think back to Tomori's perspective, where she had this loving environment and then lost it all of a sudden. Or look forward to Soyo's home life, which was once full of family fun but was quickly bleached by a sterile upper-class image and turned her into the manipulator that we know she becomes. It's in examining these other members of the band that Rana's personality comes to life. We know everything about this character. So, we've had an episode structured entirely in first person, but what's next? What is the next structural marvel that this show has to cook up for us? Well, the band's gearing up and getting ready to perform on stage for the first time. They're sat in their backstage room, nerves are building, members of staff keep checking in on them, and these big, famous performers are littered throughout the venue. How would you present this? For MyGO, they decided the best way is to build up to this performance by being as grounded as possible. It's almost a vlog-like episode, made up of in-universe camera footage, minimal cutting, no background music, overlapping conversations that don't particularly go anywhere, costume checks, practice routines, everything you could want from a lived-in venue's backstage atmosphere shortly before a live performance occurs is all packed into this episode tightly. For the most part, characters sit in this little room chatting with one another. Whenever the door opens, we get this muffled sound of people performing on stage or hurriedly running through corridors. In quiet moments, the sound of a clock ticking away makes up all the ambience.
Tomoriはライブしてくれるだけでいい。
Our band members constantly rotate in and out of the room, giving us new combinations of characters left alone to chat, and as people return to the room, they come back with stories about who they ran into or what's going on in the venue. Weirdly, by containing this episode to a single small room, the world feels so much larger. It's an episode of gossip. But dialogue and location aren't what carry that feeling alone. The secret strength here is the combination of pure ambience for audio and entirely fixed camera angles. By not piping artificial sound into the scene and by constraining the physical cameras to realistic, often reused placements, we get this very lived-in feeling, as if this were real behind-the-scenes footage or a segment of a documentary. For example, here's a camera placed over the room's entrance to capture footage of people entering and leaving the room. Another detail, much smaller this time, that adds a lot to the vibe of this episode involves the hand-drawn elements on the table, the random junk littering the scene, like the bottles, the food, the bags, all the static objects that get drawn once per angle and then repositioned or removed to suit the shot in question. This already adds a sense of time progression and gives the room this feeling of being occupied, but that's pretty typical for anime. The small detail is that they actually redo the lighting of these objects depending on whether the door is open or closed. So the angles of the shadows, the reflections in the bottles, all those tiny specifics, they switch up from shot to shot, and with this, the unmoving camera gains a sense of motion. Motion through time. Also, these shots are actually held for quite a long time, I should mention. Like, sometimes they'll switch you over to a camera looking over a corridor, you'll see one person enter on one side and leave on the opposite, and then an entirely new group will come along, hold a conversation for a bit, and do the entire walk as well. If the room only has one or two camera angles to work with, they just won't cut between them, unless they really need to. And deciding to shoot an episode like this with the realistic camera angles and the restricted scope is a genius move in its own right. It's not something you see often, particularly in anime, but it's even rarer that you see it executed so well. The audio design for this episode is amazing, the pace of it is so controlled you never feel like you're stuck in one place for too long. And that's the thing, the scariest predicament to find yourself in after making this kind of decision in storyboarding is that you may end up boring the viewers if you don't switch locations frequently and cut from camera to camera often. A lot of dialogue heavy shows take the overkill approach of just going full ADHD with the presentation, which only really highlights how boring the events unfolding are. I mean, we've all seen that one show where two characters sit in a cafe explaining basic concepts for 10 minutes and the camera is just going wild. It's not entertaining to watch, but damn do they try. But here, I guarantee they avoid that. Like the worst case scenario, swiftly avoided. And to be honest, I haven't seen anyone even mention that this episode has such limited camera angles, or that it lacks background music at all. Most viewers don't realise these things have been put in place. They don't see the limitations, not consciously. They'll feel the pre-performance atmosphere building up, which is what all of these techniques are in service for, but they won't notice what you're doing to their mind. But even if you are the kind of person who notices this stuff immediately, don't worry, because despite all of these restrictions, they still manage to frame the shots in ways that tell a good story. A bit ago I was talking about how Soyo isn't on the same page as anyone else, and could that be painted any clearer than by this sneaky little sequence? I mean look, the only face we never see, watch, is the one belonging to Soyo. The person whose goals differ so clearly from the rest is the only one we don't see. If I said communication issue, what visual would come to mind? Try a phone. Soyo has a breakdown on stage, and the band aren't sure what to do next. Anon's trying to get in contact with Soyo, but she isn't replying. Meanwhile, Soyo is desperately and obsessively trying to get in touch with Sakiko, whose phone number she finally got a hold of. Despite these characters having ways to contact the person they need to speak with, neither of them is reaching their intended target. Their words aren't reaching them. Soyo is laying in bed when a notification appears on her screen. It's a message from Anon. She ignores it and goes back to laying in silence, staring at her phone, and for a second, she pauses. Then, a dark thought suddenly hits her. In shock, she turns to Google. How to tell if you've been blocked from messaging someone. I don't know if the dots connected in your brain, but this is genius. Let me go back over this moment quickly. Soyo's there, trying to message someone, when her heart is sent aflutter by a notification sound. Is it Sakiko replying? No, it's just that Anon girl that's been annoying you for the entire show. So she lays in bed staring at her phone, and in her head she must think something like, I should block Anon. But it's that thought that fills Soyo with dread. Go through the natural thought process with me here. Anon is annoying, I should block her. Wait, I'm annoying Sakiko. Has Sakiko blocked me? You can see the cogs turning in her brain, working through these steps. It's such a good scene. And elsewhere, a depressed Sakiko meets up with a very old friend. This old friend talks about how when she's struggling and feeling down, she looks at some encouraging messages Sakiko sent her once upon a time. So, she wants to be there for Sakiko. Unlike the messages we saw earlier in the episode, these ones didn't fail to reach their recipient. In fact, despite this girl and Sakiko growing distant over the years, the messages Sakiko sent became this eternal beacon of positivity. The message arrived, and it has remained there for all those years. Elsewhere, a stray cat is trying to get in touch with her bandmates so she can play music with someone, but she doesn't know how to use a phone, so she asks someone for help. The person she asks for help explains to her that even if you see a message via the on-screen notification, it won't be marked as read unless you actually open the DM up properly. This retroactively further highlights the distance Soyo is putting between herself and Anon. When she saw Anon's message pop up, she didn't bother to open it. She's leaving the band's messages unread. But more importantly, It's a good way of showing the dynamic Rana has with others. You can never really tell how aware she is of the world around her. Is anything you tell her actually reaching her? The fact that she doesn't know how to mark DMs as read is both fitting of her personality and great symbolism of how she interacts with people IRL. You can't tell if she understands you. And the final message of the episode is one that gets sent and received. It's a proxy message that Soyo sends to Sakiko. She's going to Sakiko's house. If her phone won't work, Soyo will just have to go there in person. But more importantly than that, we get a curious image on Sakiko's lock screen. Episode 9 begins with the all-important Soyo backstory, but first, let's go back to episode 2 for a minute. Remember when we were comparing Anon and Soyo and I briefly mentioned their interactions in episode 2? In it, Soyo was trying to get information out of Anon, primarily about Tomori. Soyo's goal, of course, is to reform her old band, which Tomori was a member of, so in this scene, upon hearing that Anon invite Tomori to join her band, Soyo begins stroking her finger. Huh, I wonder what that's about, you may wonder. Then, when Soyo learns that Tomori declined the invitation, her body language changes. She masks her disappointment by fiddling with her fingernail. The meaning isn't immediately clear, but we know what triggers this behaviour. Her plan of reuniting her old band isn't working. That's the situation she's in when we first see her fiddle with her fingernail like this, but why does this matter? Because later on, in that same episode, when Taki says, Tomori ga yaru wake nai. Dousete? Tomori wa kizutsuite ru. Soyo responds by doing this. Minna kizutsuiteru yo. And there we go. This is no longer an isolated action, it's a pattern of behaviour. We now know to expect consistent body language quirks out of the cast, and by keeping track of what emotions trigger certain actions, we can begin to figure out how characters feel without, say it with me, being told how they feel. When Soyo's confronted with the breakup of the past or with the idea that the past will never return, this is what she does. Soyo is a character who lies. She doesn't let her emotions slip, not in a straightforward manner. Again, like Taki, Soyo doesn't express her emotions straightforwardly. We studied her manipulative dialogue before, but this is the other sign of her true thoughts. It's in the following episode, while explaining things to Tomori, that this behaviour becomes more than just an episodic bit of directing. She fiddles with her fingertip while talking about a trauma. But once the conversation moves onto forming a band, things start to look up for Soyo. Tomori has agreed, Taki has agreed, only 2 more members to go. And relieved, she parts her hands and with a determined clench, she tells herself, things will be alright. As we pass through the episodes, this will continue to be a handy way of inferring Soyo's thoughts as her plans slowly fall apart around her. If you pay close attention, you'll notice a close friend of hers and former bandmate even seems aware of this tell in Soyo's body language. She looks at it. Look, she can tell. This girl knows. In the scene we covered previously, featuring Soyo's manipulations of Taki, we get an incredibly disguised example showing how serious she is about concealing her true thoughts in this pivotal moment of the story. She's physically covering up the body language. In another scene, the flashback that shows Soyo's loss of the loving family and her sudden responsibility to fit in amongst a bunch of rich girls, we see it again. So finally, here we are, episode 9, the peak of Soyo's depressive spiral.
クライシックをやめさせていただきますわ。ともりはお前を待ってたんだよ。待って。せっかく楽しくやってきたんだから、むつみちゃんもそう思うよね。私はバンド楽しいって思ったこと一度もない。え？解散じゃない。まだむつみちゃん終わってない。
Forced to accept the reality she was so anxious of all this time, we get an incredible insight into how broken down her mental state must be. That refined lady image she'd been working so hard to uphold all this time. Does she even have the energy for it anymore? Her nails cracked and worn, she tries to recapture the determination we once saw from her. Repeating the scene from episode 3, she tells herself, "We'll be alright." And this time, she doesn't believe her own words. Speak of the devil, start of episode 10, Mutsumi is walking through... Wait, hang on. Who is this? Soyo's friend, former bandmate, arguably the reason the band broke up in the first place.
私はバンド楽しいって思ったこと一度もない。え?
How did it take me this long to mention her name? This is the mutual friend between Soyo and Sakiko, and it's the girl that Soyo tries to get information from so cruelly in the scene mentioned back during the Anon comparison. Story of how Soyo's precious ex-band broke up. Well, Sakiko was the one who left the band, but it's Mutsumi's scathing response that ultimately destroys it.
バンド楽しいって思ったこと一度もない。
The reason why she said that is never expanded upon. She's a very quiet girl, not one of the main characters, doesn't get much screen time, and she mostly acts as the carrier pigeon that delivers Soyo's messages to Sakiko. Until you look a little bit closer, that is. But how do you begin to look closer? Where do you begin? A while back, talking about episode 4, I briefly mentioned a particular scene. It takes a few seconds for the greeting to actually reach Tomori, but eventually she responds in kind. What I didn't mention is that at the start of episode 3, the first person Tomori episode, Tomori is walking to school when a classmate runs by and shouts, "Morning, Tomori!" It takes a couple seconds for Tomori to catch up to reality, but by the time she turns to respond, the classmate is already gone. But why am I mentioning this now? At the start of episode 10, Mutsumi is walking through the schoolyard when a couple classmates say,
ごきげんようごきげんよう。
It takes a couple seconds for Mutsumi to catch up to reality. By the time she turns to respond, the classmates are already gone. Like Tomori, Mutsumi is slightly out of sync with the world. But Mutsumi isn't a vocalist. She can't write down her thoughts onto a lyric sheet and belt them out for everyone to hear. Unlike Tomori, Mutsumi doesn't speak for herself. But in an ironic twist, it's her words that shatter any hope of their band surviving Sakiko's exit.
私はバンド楽しいって思ったこと一度もない。
Mutsumi is an incredibly empathetic person. We know this because, while Soyo suffers under her own manipulative mask, Mutsumi is the only one to take notice. She notices the fingernails. We know this because when Tomori begins performing alone, Mutsumi is the familiar face sitting in the audience the entire time. We know this because when Sakiko grabs the bill at the cafe, Mutsumi reacts with worry in an instant, far quicker than her usual slow pace. She's the mediator between Soyo's desperation for the past and Sakiko's outright rejection of it. She spends much of the story quietly trying to help others in small and, frankly, forgettable ways. Whenever people are involved, Mutsumi really seems to care. She wants everyone around her to be happy, as evident from her self-sacrificing behaviour, but she doesn't speak for herself. She's just the carrier pigeon who delivers the words others want to say. And therein lies the problem. Mutsumi empathizes heavily with the people around her, and she is made to convey their feelings to others, but Mutsumi isn't on the same page as the people she's speaking for. She's out of sync with the rest of the world. Everything we see about Mutsumi tells us that she never speaks her own thoughts, and she isn't really understood by the people around her. Even if she understands them, they don't understand her. She is an observer, more than anything, who tries to help people when she can, but that makes you wonder. Why did a girl who can't speak for herself, who loves helping others, say that line of dialogue. Who was she trying to help? Episode 11 is really best described as the resolution before the resolution. It's the build-up to the final performance, and as part of that build-up, the director seeks to resolve a bunch of the repeated elements thus far, and it does this first of all by resolving the fallout between Soyo and the band. First, it mirrors the end of episode 7's performance by having Soyo linger on stage after the others have left, trailing behind them, and then, in the exact same spot where she once cried out of anger, she now sheds tears of regret. It's a very direct mirror to a previous scene. Next up, communication issues. Last time we saw a bunch of ferns, it showed that the group struggled to actually talk to one another, even via text message. This time, now that everything's been resolved, DMing brings the group together. It allows them to organise a meetup, and these messages are even used to structure a song-making montage around. Remember the old walk home Taki and Tomori had before? I described it as, when the day is done, the members all decide to head home, Taki and Tomori splitting off from Anon and Soyo. This time, with the exact same bittersweet piano background music playing, we get to see the other side of that walk. They finally have their heart-to-heart, resulting in Anon giving Soyo a nickname.
私辞めないから、ソヨリンも辞めんなよ。は？ソヨリン？やめんなよ。やめて。
It's not a big final, woo, they're finally on the same page moment, but neither was the walk with Taki and Tomori. It was the first step towards understanding one another, and that's what this scene is too. And also in this scene, Soyo finally drops that sickly sweet voice she'd been putting on this whole time.
今さら？5人でなんて、私が断ったらどうするつもりだったんだろう。
She sounds like a normal girl. We get a similar wrap-up between Soyo and Taki, where the previous conversation involved them talking to one another from different heights, with plenty of distance between them and Soyo buried away in the shadows. This time they're, well, sat together out in the open. We get a whole bunch of other callbacks and resolutions, lots of incidental dialogue, such as the return of Anon's "as a drummer you wouldn't understand" retort that gets used in episode 4. Anon finally buys some equipment, something the show had been silently building up to all this time, and she gets to make some costumes, and the band gets a name, which were two of the things she wanted to focus on instead of learning guitar in the first couple episodes. The band take a photo together, notable because the only photo we'd seen previously had been of the previous band. The stray cat talks a bit about her past. She says that she thought something would be there for her whole life, which Tomori visibly relates to. Wonder why? Anon is seen wearing those two bandages that Tomori gave her forever ago in this episode, and speaking of Tomori, a double whammy involves two distinct scenes that are basically the same scene, in which Tomori and Anon's teacher goes over two Chinese classics. It's The Butterfly Dream and Spring Dawn, which are both used in episode 11 to reference episode 3, which was the Tomori POV episode. The Butterfly Dream is all about questioning the nature of dreams and reality. Did a man dream of being a butterfly, or is a butterfly dreaming about being a man? In episode 3, the day Tomori met Sakiko and made her first friend, that scene begins with a shot of her waking up into the light. At the end, once the band has broken up, we get another shot of her waking up into the darkness. We just see her wake the morning that her life changes for the better, and wake the morning after her life changed for the worst. Similarly, when Tomori met Sakiko, it was spring. The song she writes for the band, Spring Sunlight in English, describes the time in the line, "All I knew of spring was falling petals." On the morning after the rainy day's breakup, Tomori once again wakes to spring, and it's fitting that Spring Dawn talks of waking up on a spring morning after a rainy night, the author pondering how many petals fell in the storm. So, these two different poems are two different ways of calling back to the Tomori POV in episode 3, and they serve to resolve the lingering emotions that were planted in that little bit of repetition, with it starting waking up on a spring morning, ending waking up on a spring morning, questioning which is the dream and which is the reality, how many petals fell in the storm. And these lessons themselves are a recurring element too. These are being resolved as well. The literature teacher for Anon and Tomori, plus there's a climatology teacher for Taki, who they make their presence known throughout the show, and this is the farewell to those two teachers, so bye bye teachers. This kind of repetition has been done previously, of course, throughout the show. I mean, drink every time a train shows up. They love using the train to symbolize things. We saw the Taki-Soyo conversation spiritually matched by the Taki-Tomori one before as well. There was, in one episode, a school set chase scene where Tomori and Anon chase Taki, and then in a later episode there's a chase scene where Tomori chases Anon, and that's a bit of a mirror. And there was a good one involving a planetarium, somewhere Tomori goes to calm down when she's stressed in episode 2, I think it was. She goes there again in a later episode, but it doesn't help her this time, which shows how much worse her mental health has gotten in between episode 2 and whatever episode that happened in. And then in that same scene, she absently drifts towards a staircase and almost falls down the staircase when a girl, the old friend of Sakiko, reaches out to stop Tomori from falling, which mirrors how Sakiko saved Tomori in the past when Tomori was almost going to fall off the side of the bridge. That's two references in one. It's resolving the planetarium and it's resolving the friendship with Sakiko. So, you know, what I'm saying is this isn't a new technique for the show that they've just started implementing in this episode, but this is an episode that is entirely this. This is where it all comes together. Previously, this kind of repetition of scenery or of events was saved for important emotional beats in very important moments, but in this episode, they just go over everything. It's resolving as much as it can to allow the 12th episode to focus in on what matters most. And what is it that matters most? Well, episode 12 is the big performance. Finally, our band is together, and they are ready to play, but instead of focusing on that, a bit underwhelming, I want to take a moment to appreciate how our cast, especially our original protagonist, has grown. The episode begins with this cute little sequence as the group get ready on stage. Anon is messing with her pedal board, trying to remember what she needs for the beginning of their first song, and Soyo doesn't want to deal with Anon being slow, so she just comes over and uses her foot to casually catch Anon up. Anon complains about Soyo using her foot with it before she'd had the opportunity. This is a new board, she just bought this the previous episode, and while she's complaining about this, on the opposite side of the stage, Rana is just speeding through this process like a pro. Now, when the first song ends and Tomori begins talking to the audience to allow her bandmates time to set up and to formally introduce the now named MyGO no band, not as catchy, we once again get a show of the difference between Anon and Rana's familiarity with playing guitar. Compared to the stray cat, Anon certainly looks like a noob, but let's remember where she was when this all started. In episode 1, she dusted off her guitar and failed to play it. In episode 2, when Rana starts playing guitar in the background of a scene, Anon's immediate reaction is to plug her ears and complain about it being noisy. In episode 4, she brags about being able to play any chord, even F, she says, while she slowly fumbles her fingers into vaguely the right position before strumming that iconic dull F chord that screams, she's a beginner. In episode 5, we see her trying to play a chord by reading a tab guide, which she fails to play and then rests her guitar flat on the ground, quickly moving on to watch a video of a fashionista on YouTube. But by episode 6, she's able to play most chords by following that same guide, and she even does finger exercises. So, say farewell to that dull F chord eventually. Unfortunately, the sheet music that Taki prints out for her in this episode doesn't have any tabs, so Anon doesn't really know what to do there. She spends the rest of the episode sat in the corner, off screen, practicing by herself. Bit embarrassing. In episode 7, their first live performance, she makes a mistake and asks the band to restart twice. Then, in a moment you probably didn't realise when you were watching the show, she gets overly excited during the performance, gets too close to the microphone, and sings a random vowel into it before cutting herself off. Other than that, she keeps it together, but some moments where her inexperience is definitely showing. However, when we get to episode 8 and you start to get these communication issues, she is the only member that we see practicing. And in episode 9, she's able to casually play the song partway through on short command. You tell her to play the song at a certain part, she will begin playing the song. In episode 10, she even gets involved in an improv performance. And in episode 11, we see her buying her own gear. Remember the pedal board? She only understands what she's buying to the extent of, this is what I've been borrowing, but she immediately begins experimenting with it, much to the chagrin of other people sat at that table. What I'm saying is, it's rare that this show truly highlights the effort she's putting in, save for mention of, an occasional, you've been practicing, but in the background, we are constantly barraged by signs of her growth. And these are relatable signs, and while I'm highlighting Anon here, she's not the only one. We see Taki make strides in producing songs, going from spending ages tearing her hair out over a dog-eared bookmark-filled tutorial book and a MIDI keyboard, to creating a song in 2 days. Her naming sense for files doesn't get any better, but the progress she makes as a producer, I suppose, I don't know if we could call her a composer yet, but as a producer of songs, she's making strides. And boy, is this frame relatable. So yeah, small bit of appreciation not only for the accuracy of the equipment and what being a music noob is like, but also appreciation for the quiet manner in which this progression is handled. If you can relate to or comprehend the unmentioned moments where they're practicing, you already understand what strides they're making, and if you don't, no amount of a character shouting, wow, they're really improving, will make you truly understand how they're improving. So why bother? Just show the characters improving like a normal person would, and the results will speak for themselves. Sakiko is the stereotypically rich desuwa lady who kickstarts this entire story. She befriended Tomori, they formed a band with Taki, Soyo, and Mutsumi, and then she left. Why? We don't know, or at least we're never told. But it wasn't long ago we mentioned her childhood friend Mutsumi. Mutsumi is an incredibly empathetic person, I said. We know this because when Sakiko grabs the bill at a cafe, she reacts with worry far quicker than her usual pace. But what I didn't ask back then is, why would Mutsumi worry about a rich girl paying for some drinks? First, let's recap some things we've spoken about before. So, initially, she relates to Tomori's lyrics. That's obvious. All the characters do. That's kind of the point. When their blossoming friendship is shown in the first-person perspective episode, Sakiko joyfully sings Tomori's depressed scribbles as if she's finally found someone who understands her. Secondly, we know that she left Tomori's band for some reason. And thirdly, lest we forget, she has an image of a doll on her lock screen background. But some other details I haven't covered are that she is a rich girl who doesn't go to the school for rich girls anymore, and she says the reason for this has nothing to do with Soyo, so it's not like she's trying to avoid a stalker. She grew up in a house with a grand piano with this creepy doll overlooking it, but she sneaks into the school's music room when no one's using it in order to play piano. Weird. How about clothing? What does Sakiko wear? In episode 1, when we get the flashback to her leaving a band, this is what she's wearing. Pretty simple. Skipping ahead, episode 7, she goes to watch Tomori perform. Yep, and when she meets her old friend in episode 8, when she had her confrontation with Soyo. Are you guys noticing anything? Because I'm noticing that she only has one outfit that isn't her school uniform. And you may think, well, this is anime. That's normal, right? That's just cartoons. Except, even side characters have more outfits than Sakiko does. Despite Sakiko being arguably more important to the plot than some of the main cast are. So, in episode 12, when Sakiko meets up with a popular fashion YouTuber, remember her, flush with cash at this Swiss cafe while wearing these clothes which we know are pretty old and well worn by this point, the fashionable lady opposite the table looks her up and down. In the sweetest tone, she apologizes to Sakiko. In case you're not getting it, she just called Sakiko a poser. She took one glance at Sakiko's clothing and immediately apologized for inviting her to an expensive spot. So, bring it back. Why would Sakiko be wearing the same outfit whenever she has to go somewhere? Why would Mutsumi worry about a rich girl paying for some drinks? Why would a girl who has a grand piano at home be playing the school's piano? And why did she quit the band so suddenly? Episode 13 is all about Sakiko, all about these questions, and it does a lot to fill in the blanks without directly answering the big one. Why? But even before we get some actual time with the character, there are so many hints that end up answering all of the smaller questions, and ultimately, the final shot of episode 13 confirms the obvious theory. Sakiko's family isn't rich anymore. Far from it. With every bit of knowledge they give you, the question remains unchanged. Why did this happen? When we knew nothing about Sakiko, the question was, why did she leave? What happened? And now, with everything that we know, with a clear picture of her situation in our minds, the question is still, why did she leave? What happened? They progress this character's story. They tell you about this character while keeping a firm grip on the question you want answered most. Everything you learn just adds another layer of context to the big question, all in service of building a sequel hook, and until that sequel comes, the answers don't exist. And there we go, 13 episodes, 13 points of analysis. At first, I was a bit worried I wouldn't have enough substantial to say to fit into like 13 full sections, but it turns out there is so much stuff in the show worth examining. Like the train stuff, in particular, that's a biggie. I didn't even mention a bunch of characters that are pretty important to the story. I didn't even touch the actual band performances, and there is a world of extra material. I'd like to highlight there's one radio show hosted by the main cast. It's played straight by the voice actors on their YouTube channel. Features a bunch of original songs and covers that further tie into the verbal and visual symbolism that this anime plays with. Hey, look, a train! And it's been going since 2022, so there's a lot of cool pre-anime stuff, as well as a bunch of post-anime insights to garner from that channel. But it's a 13 episode season, so 13 sections is all I'm giving. I gotta worry about my voice, you know. I can only record so much talking, yammering to a microphone. This is like a 2-hour long recording that I'm going down here. It's actually an adaptation of a text-based post, so if you prefer reading text, go check out my blog. I don't post very often, but when I do, you know, it's a banger. Worth a subscribe. Get your email logged into that. Is that how you subscribe? I've never actually subscribed to a blog before. I'm very self-absorbent. I don't really know how to follow other people. I just know how to post. But yeah, check out my blog. Check out my game. I made a game about an idol. It's very cinematic, very movie-ish. Kind of going for a Shinkai feel, but idols. And check out Tomori's cover of Shoujo Re. I am in love with that song. Showed a tiny bit of it before, but give that song a listen. It'll be in the description. It's so good. all the covers, the radio show, it's going to be linked in the description. If you understand Japanese, give it a whirl, it's pretty fun. There is one really cute bit in like the first or the second, it's probably in the first one to be honest, where someone writes in praising Tomori's lyrics and Taki is the one reading it out and her voice lights up when she hears the praise for Tomori. It is adorable.
皆さんの歌と演奏に興奮しっぱなしでした。私は歌や演奏はもちろんですが、Tomoriさんの MC が大好きです。特に曲紹介の際に曲に込められた思いを語ってくれますが、その言葉が胸に深く響きます。
It's also like episode 14. Definitely check that one out. Yeah, I'm just rambling at this point. I like the show. I like the side material. I like these girls. I played the mobile game. I am really bad at rhythm games, it turns out. And stay sweet, keep smiling, be good. Peace.